Hello, welcome to Picture Me Coding. I am your host, Erik. And today I have alongside me my co-host, Mike Mole.
Greetings.
Greetings, Mike. Nice and hot day.
Very hot. It's around 95 where I'm at.
Hotter than where I'm at. I wanted to talk to you about Jason Isbell's album, Weather Vanes, this week. We've talked about it a bunch. Are you comfortable talking about Jason Isbell's Weather Vanes?
I can get comfortable, yeah.
Okay. I'm glad you can see a way to get there. I've been listening to this album a lot, and I don't. It's not like a desert. It's not like a love. I kind of like it. Should you not? Should you only talk about albums you love? I wonder. I kind of like it.
Yeah, I don't dislike it either. I think I keep wanting him to remake Southeastern, and he keeps not doing that.
So I have this, and I raised this to you when we were just talking about it earlier on the weekend. Some of the songs on the new album feel a little inauthentic to me, but I think that might be my fault because there's almost like a formula there. Like they don't seem that different. You know, there's a song like one's called Strawberry Woman. I like that song. Middle of the Morning. King of Oklahoma, I kind of like, although there's a few things about it that I don't like as much. But are these really dissimilar to the types of songs he was writing on Southeastern or Something More Than Free?
Yeah, I thought about it a little bit, and I really don't know. I think they have a little bit more of a rock and roll feel because he's working with the 400 unit band. I think maybe they're a little bit more like what he was doing with the drive-by truckers back in the day rather than the solo albums that he did, Southeastern and Something More Than Free. Yeah, I haven't been able to really qualify what it is about his last couple of albums that have attracted me less than his previous solo work.
I really like the Nashville sound. Actually, I may be getting that wrong. I should have looked up the name of it. But I didn't really like Reunions. Reunions felt a little also kind of inauthentic. Like there just was something missing for me there. There's a documentary about them making Reunions on HBO. It's called Jason Isbell Running with Our Eyes Closed, and his wife Amanda Shires, who plays fiddle, she made this comment that shocked me, where she said some of this music just feels fake. I was like, "Whoa, that was my take. How could she say that out loud?"
Yeah, I don't know if I get that sense. Um, I think maybe he's just striving to do something different than what he used to be doing. Um, it's clearly the case that he's trying to be more topical, I think. Maybe that's not the right word, but a lot of his songs seem to touch at least obliquely on political themes and uh, at least modern events. So I don't know. Sometimes I find that off putting, and sometimes I'm fine with it.
I guess I just wonder if do some of the, well, so I grew up in San Diego, listened to hardcore music, hardcore bands, had a lot of friends who played in bands. And I have this embarrassment that shows up every time there's a fiddle on a song, which is, oh no, am I listening to country music? That'd be bad if my friends caught me listening to country music. I think that's on me though. That's my problem. But there are some moments on this album where there's a fiddle on there, and this is apologies to Amanda Shires who does great work. But some of the fiddle, like I'm not sure if it's really adding to a song that already itself is like not quite getting there for me. Like a song like King of Oklahoma, I saw this, you know, it doesn't quite do it. I can listen to it, but it's not a song I'm really excited about.
Yeah, I definitely don't have that problem. Having grown up on a farm in Indiana and having driven around in my dad's F-150 for years with only an AM radio and only having country music to listen to, I don't feel I feel like it's kind of my thing, even though I've branched out and listened to lots of other stuff. But I think maybe I kind of wish he would be a little bit more country. I think maybe his solo albums were maybe a little bit more in that vein. I don't know.
There's something ineffable there. I guess the last comment that I would have for you, and I might be reaching a bit here, is when some of the songs feel inauthentic, my question then becomes, well, is there a formula? Are we retreading? And as a musician, I imagine you get punished both for doing retreads of earlier things and also branching out and doing something that feels a little more experimental or abstract or different from what you're used to. But sometimes I wonder if my response to music like this is based on the surprise that I get from hearing it. And it's almost like country music is a style of music where you don't ever want to be surprised. It's extremely formulaic. But like everything I've ever heard from, this is a terrible linkage. Everything I've ever heard from Run the Jewels has pretty much shocked me. But just a completely astounded surprise from pretty much everything I've ever heard. And all that stuff's very listenable. And I think when I heard Cover Me Up on Southeastern, there's something really surprising about that song, the depths he reaches to and the story that he's telling. And there's stuff on Something More Than Free that's the same. So I kind of wonder, maybe I'm just not surprised by the stuff on these albums. And that's why I don't go, oh, I need this in my life. And it's more just like, oh, I can listen to this.
Yeah, I think that's probably an aspect of there's this dichotomy with country music, at least for me, where I want things to be familiar. For example, there's a new Coulter Wall album out, and I know both you and I have listened to him in the past, and um, I really like the fact that he, wants to sound like Hank Williams and Merle Haggard, and I pretty much know what I'm going to hear when I listen to him. I don't know. Maybe it's derivative, maybe it's formulaic, but I like it. Um, but what comes to mind for me? So on Weather Vanes, there's a quote in the song White Beretta. Um, there's a line taken from a Sunvolt song, and you and I both, I think, include Sunvolt's Trace among our favorite albums of all time.
That's a good one, yeah.
And I don't know, just so many great songs on that album, but I don't know if any of them are things that I would not have expected to hear from Sunvolt. I don't know.
Hmm. All right. How about you? What have you been listening to?
Uh, so my choice for this week is something which is also kind of a throwback. I came across this band called the Tubs, and they have an album out called Dead Meat. Um, it sounds a bit like a punk album from the title, but um, the music is essentially sort of a throwback to 1980s college radio music. So it's got jangly guitars and uh, you know bits of The Cure, maybe bits of the
Oh,
Smiths.
those are
Uh,
surprising names to pull out there.
yeah, the jangly guitars of early REM stuff. Anyway, I really enjoy it. It's got lots of really hooky melodies, and it definitely has a sense of nostalgia. There's also a great music video on YouTube starring the guy who plays Colin Robinson on What We Do in the Shadows. It's a really funny music video.
The energy vampire. So is the music energy vampiric?
No, I would say the opposite. In fact, although this particular song is it's kind of a song about mental illness, but a catchy song about mental illness. Um, but the video is quite funny. I think the actor's name is Mark Proksch or something like that.
Hmm.
But in the video, he's playing a Lyft driver who is playing this song, at full blast with his passengers in the car. So the video sort of consists of reaction shots of his passengers in the back seat, some of whom enjoyed the song and some of who clearly just want him to turn it off. But yeah, definitely. The song is called Around the Bend. The band is called the Tubs. And so if you want to look them up on YouTube, I I recommend the video highly.
It's like our dream, right? We force people into our car and we force them to listen to these random things.
Yeah.
And we don't care what the look on their face. It's just like, you got to hear this. You may hate it, but you have to hear it.
Yeah, I remember it reminds me once of many years ago. My mother was visiting me in San Diego, and I was driving around playing REM on the radio. And my mom, who was a classically trained pianist, said, "Can you please turn off this noise?" So
That's pretty tough. That's pretty
I
rough
kind
right
of
there.
thought of REM as being like the least parentally offensive music you could possibly play, but apparently not.
Yeah, it wasn't Ministry or something like that. That would have
Right.
been even worse. Um, Thanks for bringing that up. I wanted to ask you about open source software this week. I am once again in a position at work where I am reinventing things that may exist in the open source world or cobbling together software applications that are sort of open source, collections of open source libraries stitched together. I don't want to assume that that's what most developers do, but there's a way in which I sometimes take a step back. I look at what we do as software developers in our industry, and there's something very weird about it. And I'll tell you, there are two things I find weird about it. One, there are a lot of people with our skill set doing a lot of work and giving it away for free. That's weird. What are their motivations for that? Why does that even happen? And two, there are industries, businesses that exist because of all this work that people have done and given away for free. I mean, my whole career as a developer over the last decade, it arguably wouldn't exist if open source, if there wasn't this kind of explosion in libraries in open source. I got hired to write Python Django applications, 12 years ago. So I think this is weird. Do you ever step back and go, wow, this is weird?
It is a little unusual. Um, I guess Eric Raymond's sort of the guy who's written the most about the phenomenon, the economics of the free source movement and what motivates people to do it, and um, how it's different from proprietary and closed software.
Eric Raymond wrote The Cathedral and the Bazaar, right?
Yeah, among other things on free source, that's probably what he's best known for.
So I actually put that essay, and maybe I'm wrong here, as the beginning of our contemporary era of open source. And I actually would characterize it even like in a more kind of dramatic way. And I think I've told you this before. I'm pretty sure I've told you this before, but I actually think that at some point in the future, 500 years, 600 years from now, historians will look at our current era and they'll think of it as like the Italian Renaissance, but for software. And the reason why I think that makes sense is, somebody could write a PhD thesis about building an HTTP server where you can send instructions to it, and you'll use HTTP methods to do that. And that thesis then becomes, you know, web frameworks, and people will contribute software that can achieve this. They'll open source it. It's free. Anybody can download and use it. Once people can download and use those foundational tools, they'll build things that add on to it, and you have this feedback loop, this self-reinforcing thing. It's similar to the Italian Renaissance in my mind. The Catholic Church might commission a painting, and a painter might paint the mountains more blue that are farther distant from your eye than the mountains closer. And then that painting will hang in a church or maybe a government building, or millions of people will see it in a year, and they'll feed off of those ideas. And you'll have this kind of virtuous cycle of feedback and ideas compounding. So I think that we are in this renaissance for open source software. I believe that to be the case. And I think there's two things that follow from that. One is, well, it probably can't last forever, right? And the other thing is the rate of change when you're in that period of like frothy ideas bouncing off of each other and people constructing new ideas. The rate of change is so great that as a member of this community, it's easy to feel like I'm worn out, overwhelmed. This is similar to people complaining about like JavaScript frameworks getting, turning obsolete within 2 years or something like that. New JavaScript frameworks coming out in an exaggerated way, people say every single week. What do you think? Are we in a renaissance period for open source software?
I think that's a reasonable way to look at it. I think it's possible that we may be reaching the end of that. Um, I think I've seen more about open source maintainers getting burned out, or open source maintainers, having to move on to other things for economic reasons. I think I've seen a lot more of that in the last few years than I had previously. Um, it's hard for me to say if that's, I don't have any data on whether that's more common than new people coming in to contribute to open source, but it does seem like the the motivations that people used to have of doing it to, say, demonstrate their skills, or doing it with the hope that it might lead to something else that was, they got paid for. I think that is maybe becoming less and less of a motivation, because the industry has become sort of complacent and expects these things to be free now.
Hmm.
Uh, I
That
guess
seems like a problem if that's the case. I'm sorry, go ahead.
it's maybe not 100% true, because there are, well-known, very popular packages which are sort of sponsored by corporate entities.
Like Kubernetes, for example.
Yeah, Kubernetes, but also things like Pandas, which didn't come out of a company, but there are organizations that are, feeding money into the development of it.
I would
Um,
bet that's a small percentage of open source, though, that we use, right? Like you look at a random software application somebody builds at work, maybe it's an HTTP server. They probably load a dozen or 2 dozen libraries into that thing or more, depending on the ecosystem. Probably a few of them are actually, have paid contributors.
yeah, I haven't seen the data on that. I'm sure there's something out there, but I would guess it's a very small percentage, and it's very connected to, how frequently that package is used, especially used within uh, businesses like Google and Meta and so forth.
I guess I look at the state of what we do as software developers, the industry we work in, the fact that so much of our work relies on open source, and I can't help but think this looks really weird. Are there any other industries where you work so, you know, widely with things that people have done, given away for free? And I'm not even sure if it's worth trying to go into the motivations of why people do that work, but I can't help but wonder. When I was in Chicago, I knew someone who we used to have his argument, and his argument was nobody starts a band to not, they'd start a band because they want to get rich. And I would be like, no, some people just start a band to make music that they've never heard before. There's this creative passion and impulse. And we were arguing about the motivations of why people would do this. And I think maybe you could have the same kind of argument with software. It's like maybe people open source things because they've got some creative itch they want to scratch. But it's hard to then take that motivation, that gas motivation, and look at our industry and think, wow, as I go to my job every day, a portion of my job is stitching together a whole bunch of lines of code that people have just freely contributed to the world. It seems super weird.
Yeah, it is a phenomenon that I don't know that has been seen in other industries. I mean, clearly there are cases where, very early days of the automobile industry, I think, there were a lot of contributions from people who were not much more than hobbyists, probably, but they were trying to build their own cars, and so their motivation was, I want a car. And a lot of them became entrepreneurs and tried to reproduce those cars and sell them to other people. But um, I I think it's different in the sense that there was some point at which the hobbyists really weren't contributing to the industrial production of cars, and that's in our industry, that it's still quite impressive how many people are contributing things to projects that are very deeply intertwined with the running of actual businesses.
So I'm glad that you agree with me that there's something really weird about it and that it seems uncommon or maybe even unique. I'm really interested that you said you see it coming to an end, but I want to push that question out. Well, I want you to put your CTO hat on for a second and imagine you're talking to somebody who's running a company. They started a company maybe recently or I don't know, a decade ago. They don't have a software background and you need to describe to them, okay, they come to you with a software request. You say, yes, we can build that. They don't immediately anticipate what goes into building it and what goes into maintaining and owning that over the long term. When I think maintaining and owning is part of this conversation, the stuff just doesn't stay built. It takes all this care and feeding. And part of that is because we're using all these open source libraries that also get updated. How do you describe that to somebody who wants to come to you and have a more transactional relationship? CEO wants to come to the CTO, you, and say, can your team build me this thing? And once they build it, can we build something else and forget about that other thing?
So I think you always have this question of, should I build it or should I buy it? And the open source world throws a third option in there, which is, should I build this on something that is effectively free to purchase? Um, I think what you're getting at is there is a cost of ownership to anything, even if the initial capital layout is zero. There's always this cost of maintaining things, and there hasn't really been much of an argument there with respect to things like Linux, for example. People there are cases where people use commercial operating systems to run businesses, but there really hasn't been a case where there has been a really good alternative to Linux. I think maybe even to the detriment of the uh, of the industry sometimes. People have talked in the past about how Linux essentially practically killed research on operating systems because
Oh,
it's
that's interesting. Yeah.
Unix and Linux have become so dominant, especially in the server world, that you know there's I don't know what the research world looks like in that area, but I've heard people say there's considerably less funding for operating system research than there would have been had there not been a Unix and a Linux.
I'm
Um,
glad you bring up Linux as an example because I associate open source as a successful movement, if we can call it kind of like almost a social movement. I associate it with Linux. Linux is like the poster child. And I associate the birth of Linux in, well, I guess 1991 when the Linux kernel was published. I know it's on my birthday because every year on my birthday people say "Happy birthday, Linux!" So I think it was 91. Um, I associate Linux as like the example of the most successful open source project in the world, but it may have also trained us to think about what an open source project, what it looks like, and how we are meant to use them and how they fit into what we do. An operating system is a thing I put my stuff on. It's like a box that I set down so that I can stand up on it in order to reach a higher shelf.
yeah, I think you're right in the sense of Linux being the sort of archetype of the successful free source open source project, and I'm not 100% sure why that is. I think partially it's because having the source code for your operating system is a useful thing to have in many applications. But I also think that Linux in particular has maybe been successful because it has been there aren't huge barriers to contributing to it. There aren't
Mm.
huge barriers to modifying it. Um, I think even I vaguely recall Raymond making this point as well that even other free implementations of Unix have not been as popular, like FreeBSD, for instance,
Mm.
because they have a slightly bigger barrier to making contributions. Um, and I think that's maybe true with all free source projects. Is that the more easy it is to make a contribution to that project, both in terms of the social dynamic of making that change and the actual technological process you have to go through to make that change. Um, it's been a benefit to Linux and most other successful open source projects.
I think that's a good point. I buy that. If I have a low barrier to entry to being able to contribute back to a thing, I'm more likely to use that thing in the future. I think that's what you're arguing, and if so, I would definitely be. I would buy that.
Yeah, well, I think you make this point in our day to day work as well, that people will tend to use things where the developer experience is better, even if it's just an internal tool. They're going to be more likely to contribute to that. They're going to be more likely to pull that into their project if they don't have to think too much about building it and the make system works and all that kind of stuff. I think we didn't have the term developer experience back in the day when Linux was a new thing. But I think that's it's not, you have to be fairly sophisticated to get involved in contributing to something like Linux, but uh, really the barrier is surprisingly low given the power of it and what you're actually what you're actually making.
I want to tell a little bit of a story now, and I might be completely wildly reading into things here, and you, with your experience, can tell me now. I don't really remember it unfolding that way or not. But moving on from Linux as an example, you have different distributions, say Debian or like Red Hat, and these distributions then come along with package managers where you can easily load more software into your system. And I sort of always assumed that those package managers then became a model for other open source ecosystems like Perl and CPAN, where you can load Perl libraries, or Python. In the early days, right now it's PyPI, and pip is a package installer in Python, but it used to be the cheese shop. That these were modeled after Linux and package managers. And so it's not just that you have this incredible example of Linux as an open source software that you can contribute back to, but you have this way to share software. And it's so easy for me, it's trivial for me to download millions of lines of code and immediately get to work using it. Is that a naive telling of the story? Do you remember how you went from everything self-contained, you build everything, it's not invented here, it doesn't exist, to starting to use more packages in your day-to-day work? Do you remember that?
Yeah, vaguely. I'd have to think about it hard to remember the exact points in time. But if you look at the distribution channels in the early '90s, if you wanted to get involved with Linux, it was sort of socially and technically probably about the same thing as wanting to become a ham radio operator. It
Mm,
was it was a pretty niche thing. It was a very nerdy thing, and I know that the first the first distributions of Linux that I personally got came on CDs,
mm,
CD-ROMs.
mm-hmm.
Um, so there's been this progression, not just in the package managers, but in the way that these things are available to people. So there was a point where you had to get them on physical media. There was a point where SourceForge came along. The internet became, enough people had access to enough bandwidth that things like SourceForge could exist, and you could have open source packages where you could get source code and binary distributions from a website. I think Git and GitHub also sort of changed the game in
Mm-hmm.
that there was sort of this standardization around revision control and having a place where you can get stuff essentially for free. You can host
Mm-hmm.
stuff essentially for free and grab it from there as well.
It's kind of a one-stop shop. Anything you need, you can get it here. I mean, you mentioned having stuff on CD. I used to download ISOs of Debian, and Suzy was the first distribution I used. This would have been probably 2004. And I had to download it, ISOs, and I would use like a BitTorrent client to do that. And then I would burn them to CD, and then I would install them. And I used to have all these random CDs around of different Linux distributions. When I first got into Linux, I would be like, let me try these other flavors of Linux. So you're right. It definitely has gotten a lot easier to get your hands on software. Maybe that's part of the story of this weird open source world that we live in. The distribution, the ability to immediately access software is so wide scale. So easy for me. There's so few barriers to entry. So few barriers to entry to contribute and few barriers to entry to download the stuff is maybe what leads to this milieu of there's a lot of the stuff that people are writing and sharing, and then we use that in our day-to-day jobs. Is it weird from a sense of a business to know that I'm building my business on top of all of these volunteers, and I hope they keep volunteering because it's going to be hard to run my business if they don't keep volunteering?
I suppose there's probably a divide between the people in any given company who know what the systems are being built on and the people in the company who are, doing the financial planning for the company. So, our bosses likely don't know that we are building these systems kind of on the back of open source systems, and to a certain extent, we aren't. We're using Docker images that are built on Debian, but we're also hosting them on commercial cloud providers. And I think probably the people who run the business see the bills from the cloud provider, and that's that's sort of where their interest in the systems end.
Do you, when you think about how you've built software in your career, C++, Java, Python, other languages in there, how things have evolved over time? You've been in the industry a long time. Do you look at it and go, wow, it's weird how we build applications now? Or does it seem like, oh, this is significantly better? It may be a little weird. I mean, how do you think about the evolution of what it means to be a software engineer?
I don't know that if it's weird. It's changed, and it's changed pretty rapidly. I in it's only been 20 years ago that I was at a company that was still shipping shrink wrapped boxes to customers, and that would do 6 months release cycles, and then we'd send a new shrink wrapped box to a customer. And at that point in time, the whole idea of software as a service, platform as a service, was still sort of a dream on the horizon. And that's only been 20 years, so uh, it's definitely. I think it's evolved in the sense of there's there's not only a different way of deploying software to people, it's had a pretty fundamental effect on the way that people actually do the work.
Hmm.
So when we were shipping things in on CDs to companies, it made sense to work on 6 month cycles and plan things that far ahead, and it made sense to do very very extensive QA in separated QA environments, because once you put that software on the CD and send it to the customer, it was going to be very hard to modify.
It's frozen in place. It's pretty static, as opposed to right now where I might have continuous delivery. I might deploy my software 100 times a day.
Yeah, I mean that's been the really big change as well. I mean, between between the company that was sending out shrink wrapped software, and my next job where um, I was working for a fairly large internet company that I will not name. The difference in what we were doing was pretty vast. The services that we were providing at that internet company were in a data center, and the the actual bits never got sent to the customers. But still, it was before the point where there were things, well understood tools for building things on. There was no Terraform, there was no Helm, there was no Kubernetes, and so the process of putting stuff out into that data center was still pretty tricky.
Pretty
Um,
onerous, yeah. It's pretty easy now, like, but it's almost like it's easy as a function that I need it to be easy because Things change so rapidly. And there's almost, I think, this fatigue that I see sometimes among developers who sit in our chairs like, why can't stuff just not change so much? It's like
Yeah.
it's a curse and a gift to be present at this moment in time where things are rapidly changing.
Yeah, I don't know how much of that is specifically related to the open source world.
Yeah,
Um,
I guess I was thinking from a burden of a maintainer of a software project that, like we mentioned Kubernetes a couple times. They have this really short release cycle. I might be wrong, but it was 6 months or 9 months. So virtually every 6 or 9 months, you're upgrading a cluster. A cluster may have hundreds of machines. You may have thousands of Kubernetes pods. That's a lot of work potentially. And like they're improving the Kubernetes project, so you want to upgrade, but it's significant the amount of work that goes into it. So you might feel like, wow, can we just take a break for a while? Like we'll just freeze all the software and we won't change anything, and it'll just stay working. That just doesn't seem to happen.
yeah, I do think that has changed a little bit over the last 10 to 15 years, though. I mean, there was a point in time where even if you were doing software as a service, you would probably start with something like CentOS, maybe where the base server that you were using was maybe a few revs behind. You might not be able to get the most recent version of Python because that operating system had been kind of vetted for security reasons. And
We
I
had that
think
at my
that,
last employer, and it was always like you're shaking your fist at the team that's limiting you.
yeah, I mean, there was even a time not that long ago when, I mean, this may still be true in a lot of companies where, companies would be 2 or 3 revisions behind on their browser,
Hmm.
and they don't they push out these the software to the company laptops, and you can't update it yourself, so you're
You're stuck on
using
IE8 forever.
yeah, yeah, back in the day it was IE7 and IE8, and it was a kind of a burden on software developers to make things work across these browsers that were now reaching the end of their support life. But um, that seems to have changed a bit now. I don't have a lot of visibility into Fortune 500 companies, how they are deploying things to their employees at this point in time. But at least in our world, it seems like we place a premium on keeping things updated. Um,
If you
we get
don't, you get this massive burden over time. If you just, it's like this technical debt just gets bigger and bigger if you don't keep things up to date. You want to build a project that hasn't been built in over a year? Good luck.
yeah. Plus, we're constantly getting this stream of security
Hmm.
issues that need to be fixed with updates. So
Yeah,
um,
maybe they should just build that stuff without bugs in there in the first place, right?
yeah, that would be nice.
You said you see this period, if you accept my premise, which is that open source, the kind of pace, the rate of change of ideas, the sort of virtuous cycle we have where ideas feed on ideas and they propagate widely. If you accept that my Italian Renaissance analogies, it works. Maybe someday people will look at this period in that way. I say if that's true, eventually it will come to an end. You say you think you see it coming to an end. Can you make that argument? I was surprised you said that.
I'm not sure if I can make it or not. And to be clear, I don't think that people are going to start closing, doing closed source stuff again. I don't think the unless something radically changes, like somebody comes out with a practical quantum computer or something where uh, Alphabet or IBM is the only company that can write the operating software for it.
Okay, good edge case example. So that we're
Yeah,
probably not considering that.
yeah. Not considering that, I think that the open source world is not going to change in that people are not going to start giving it up for commercial alternatives. But I do believe that maybe the open source heyday that we sort of think about was like maybe the late 70s when everybody was starting a punk band. It was, you didn't have to be really good at it.
Hmm.
You didn't have to be a great musician. It wasn't expensive. You could have some fun. And I think now there's this point where there is so much stuff and there are so many developers that I guess it's a little bit like the old joke about nobody goes there anymore because it's so crowded. But there are so many alternatives that I think if you were to, some of the motivation of writing something so you can put it out and share it with your friends is gone, just because there's no, unless you find that particular niche where nobody else is doing a particular thing, there's no real benefit to writing an alternative anymore.
Hmm.
Um,
Well, we do have new languages, so we're using the last few years, like Rust, really cool
yeah,
language I like to write. I know you like to write it too. There's a lot of stuff that can be built in the Rust world. So if we just keep doing new things, then we'll always have new ground
yeah.
to cover, new punk music to write.
But even there, I think as much as I like Rust, I think I've heard people complaining that a very large percentage of Rust is people rewriting tools that were originally in C and Rust, and there's good reasons to do that in a lot of cases,
Yeah, we
but
hate C, right? We just hate it.
well, it still seems to be quite popular.
It's very
Uh,
popular. Yeah, it's used all over. I usually write a lot of Python, and that's written in C. Whoops.
so I think there are probably people inventing new things with Rust, and I think there will be some really good things to come out of new things to come out with that language that are better and more secure than their predecessors. But um, I do think that sort of punk rock phase of open source is maybe behind us now. Um,
I wonder if it's because people know the burden involved. So you said maybe a lot of ideas, a lot of ground has been covered. I'm working on something this week where Azure, we're using Azure at work. They have a product called Service Bus, which is an AMQP service. So AMQP like RabbitMQ. And I need, in the Python world, I need like a really lightweight task runner. I just want to put a task on there. I want to pull it back off. I want to run it. I can write this bespoke for a particular application, or I could write a library. Library doesn't really exist. You could potentially use in the Python world a thing called Celery, but that doesn't really apply in this case for other reasons. And I'm looking at what I'm doing and thinking, oh, I could package this up. I could make it an open source library. And my immediate next thought is, oh, what a bummer if people started using it though. They'd come and write to me and say, can you fix this problem that I have? And I'd be on the weekend, and really what I want to do is go to the beach. I don't care about their issue. That's actually my response why I don't want to share stuff.
yeah, I have one package on GitHub that has something like 15 stars, and every year or two I get a request from somebody to make a change to it. And to be perfectly honest, I've kind of forgotten how it works. So I I generally just either ignore the requests or reply that I don't have time to do it or that I don't know how to do it, and I feel bad about that. So I have the same sort of reaction. Even if I thought I had a better data science library or something like that, I would be it would have to be extremely innovative for me to want to put it out into public and and let it compete with the existing options.
You'd have to believe in it, and we're mature enough, I want to say, to know that you know in advance that your belief has to persist for maybe the next decade, or maybe the next 5 years, until you can rope in enough other people to co-maintain it with you. And that's maybe a high burden right there.
Yeah, I hear stories about this quite often now, and maybe it's just because there are so many projects that it was inevitable that we start seeing cases like this where the maintainers are burnt out or even harassed in certain cases.
Yeah, that seems terrible. Every time I file an issue with a GitHub repo, I'm like, I'm sorry, I really like your work. Could we look at this too?
Yeah.
But I also am asking them so that they could fix something so then I could go back to do my job and they're going to do it for free. So that's kind of a jerk thing I'm doing to them, probably. Can you do some work for free so that I can keep doing my job?
Yeah, I mean, it's got to be a pretty significant burden on the maintainers because, when you put that out there, you want it to get better. But also, one of the sort of key ideas is that I'm putting it out there so that other people can make it better.
Hmm.
And when things become popular enough that people think you are somehow obligated to fix the problems for them, uh, I, I personally could not deal with that. I would probably just abandon the project if I ever got to that point.
Abandon it. So I think that our Italian Renaissance of open source software, I think it's going to end someday. I'm surprised you say you see it kind of starting to draw down. I don't see that. Maybe it's one of those things where you don't know you're in a recession until you're in it. I can't see it ending anytime soon. It seems like the pace, the rate of change is as wild as it has been over the last decade. Um, I kind of I tend to disagree a little bit. I think it's going to keep going nuts for a while, but then suddenly it'll stop. And I can't tell you what social forces are going to be involved in making this stop.
Yeah, I'm not sure either. In if you look at the actual Renaissance, I guess the reason that the Italian Renaissance wound down is because you know the power of Florence diminished, and the power of other countries, Spain in particular, kind of rose in contrast. And I don't so that some to stop open source or to you know reach a point where the open source renaissance is ending, there probably has to be something else that comes along,
Hmm.
which is an even more dominant force. And maybe that's what we talked about last week. Maybe
Yeah,
that's large language models. Um,
AI. Yeah, yeah, I can see that.
you've made this point a couple of times, which I kind of like, that maybe at some point writing software is so easy for the AIs that they just write it, solve the problem, and throw it away. And if we reach that point where AIs can spin up general purpose software in the blink of an eye, maybe having an army of volunteers to build it is irrelevant.
Yeah, at that point, I imagine that we're like raccoons with these massive garbage piles of open source libraries that we've learned over the years. And the LLM's like, I don't need your garbage pile. I could just make garbage and throw it away as needed. And we're like, don't touch my garbage.
Yeah, or another possibility is that the AIs, they already know where the good thing is, and they just go grab it. They have like Stack Overflow internalized in their heads, in their
I would be surprised if the LLM's like, let me stitch together this web framework and this other thing, and I will assemble your stuff. But that's how we write stuff. And if the LLM learns from us, it might do the same. Anyway, we're getting out there a little bit. I think you made a really interesting point overall, which I think is probably the last little thing to end on here, which is there are social forces involved in what we think of as the phenomenon of open source at its scale that it's at right now. And if you can anticipate the way those social forces might change, and you can anticipate the way in which the conditions may no longer be right for this weird frenzy of activity around open source. What do you think? Any other comments about open source? Anything you hate about it?
There's nothing I really hate about it. I think I am one of the people who shares the feeling that there's probably too much stuff. There was a point in my life when I thought that was a good thing. I kind of thought that, if you have 10 alternatives for everything, there's going to be some sort of evolutionary process whereby, the better things win out. And, maybe if there's several good things, they somehow combine into one better thing.
Isn't that what
Um,
Chairman Mao talked about with his thousand flowers bloom thing?
I will defer to you on that one.
I don't
But
know. I'm just reaching back there.
I uh, I used to anticipate this sort of evolutionary process whereby putting out enough software that did enough interesting things, you would eventually evolve to better solutions for particular things. And I don't think that's true. I think at this point, basically, you have a lot of signal, a little bit of signal, and a lot of noise.
Mhm.
And really the only thing that's helping us keep it all in check now are things like Stack Overflow and Reddit, where you
Oh,
can
interesting.
basically ask other people where to find the thing that you need.
So it sounds like there's a volume thing there. That's really interesting. So if I just kind of keep exploding mountains, I'll find a little bit more gold dust. So really what we're saying, open source community, is keep building as much garbage as you can, and sometimes through that stuff we'll get something cool. All right, thanks for answering my questions. I appreciate the discussion. I think about this topic a lot, so it's nice to have you to help me untangle these weird thoughts, the things I find weird about it. So this is Picture Me Coding. My name's Erik Aker. My co-host is Mike Mole. That's it for this week. We'll see you next week.